Welcome to Season 3 of Conscious Conversations, where we aim to inspire deep and meaningful interactions that grow into a community of practice that is committed to healing, resilience, and expansion. So in this Conscious Conversations, we are speaking to Michael Fisher, and we're talking about the path of fearlessness, healing, and liberation. And the concept of fear and fearlessness has come to me in my own journey. And as a researcher, and as a person on a path of personal healing and personal decolonization, I've come to understand fear in specific ways, but I feel like Michael will help me, and therefore everyone who is listening to this conversation understand fear a little bit in a deeper way. So when we look at fear, we can start looking at society and how society is structured. Societies across the globe are built on a dominant culture, an oppressive, violent, hurtful, exploitative, destructive, fear-based culture that thrives on inequalities in terms of gender, race, class, and income. Dominance as a cultural construct has for centuries had a strong presence in institutions, influencing the socio-political agenda and landscape of societies. Fear as a concept, especially in relation to its opposite, love, is one of the most important and under-researched concepts of our time. Love is said to be a pattern that is life-giving, that is regenerative, healthy, and emancipatory. And fear is said to be a pattern of death, degeneration, disease, and enslavement. Fear-based conditioning is created when a person is hurt and does not heal that hurt, causing a disassociation from love. It is a cause of great trauma. Fear is a dominant symptom in non-self-regulating, hurting, and violent societies that have been subject to oppression and domination. In turn, like a virus, this fear infects ideologies, myths, beliefs, values, and social cultural context for societies. Fear and love are directly related, and so fearlessness and liberation are also directly related, but we never get to think of them in those ways. Michael has been studying fears for many years. In fact, for years, you started studying fear even before I was born. So I think we can safely say you're an expert on the concept. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for sharing your time with me. Thank you for all the work you have done. I mean, I've been looking into some of your earlier work in the 90s, and I really think it's absolutely incredible. And I'm shocked that the academic space has not caught on to this subject, particularly because in this time, psychology tends to focus on trauma, mental wellness, or mental illness quite a lot, but they do not seem to be focusing on fear and fearlessness. Before we get into the subject, can you please share with our listeners, with our viewers, who Michael is, how you got onto this path, and what has really kept you going in this work? Because I'm sure there are many other very topical studies you could have gotten into and that could have also resulted in maybe a more prominent career profile, right? But you have been resolute in your search to understand fear and fearlessness in deeper ways. Who is Michael?
Yes, well, thank you. Of course, I'm still trying to figure out who Michael is. Every time I write down what I think my identity is, it's like it's still more and more complex. And then I forget that I'd written down that, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing, and then I go into something else, and it's a total mess of who I am. So, but for structural purposes, for a conversation, I could have gone into environmental and ecological domain of studies. That was my first career path, if so to speak, coming out of my earliest 20s. And I was very dedicated, obviously, to the condition of the planet Earth, this great mother, this great source, this great gift. And why are we treating it so horribly? Why are humans generally, not saying everybody in all cultures, but generally humans, that was the question I had. Why are they spoiling? Why is our species spoiling its own nest? This seems to be insane. This is not a rational understanding of how to live. Mm-hmm. So I already had that when I was basically 15, 16 years old. But by the time I went to college, I was 18, 19, 20. I was committed. I was committed that I'm going to live my life. It's not me about getting married, having children, having a house, having cars, blah, blah, blah. You can see I was an environmental. So that's a commitment. And when you start that commitment, because I had a love for nature, I wouldn't say I had a love for people. I had a love for nature first at that age. And to learn to love people again has been a long journey and a healing path to do. Because it's a lot of reasons for that, which I don't need to go into all of them, but there's trauma in my generational history. There's trauma within my family on, autobiographical history. And just the way I saw the humans around me, my culture, the West, I'll call it North America where I live, which I can speak about more accurately than anywhere else, is I'm not liking the way humans are. I do not like the way we are generally and the damage we do and take little responsibility for it. So you can just hear the radical part of me already politically sensitive, but nobody was telling me how to think. I was just coming up with this on my own. Well, then I went from environmental sciences when I realized is that, love studying animals, wildlife, walking in the woods and counting ducks, which is what I did on lakes and so on for my first part of my young career. I realized that wildlife is not the problem. The problem is humans, humans, humans. So I hope to change my career. The voice came to me literally, walking in nature, and on a beautiful day, there's no reason I should think otherwise, that I'm having a great life. But something said, it's not a great life, and the world is not in great shape, and it's not going to get much better without major transformation.
Sure.
So I said, education would be next. So I went and got a degree in education, became a teacher.
Why do you think you had that connection with nature?
Well, nature is who I am at the source, you could say. It is the being. Of all beings, in another way to say it, many ways to connect. It is that sort of unity experience, that oneness acceptance when I'm walking and with nature, when I lay down on the soil and I put my face into the soil and I listen and I just feel and my heart connects. That was my really peaceful bonding. I didn't get that peace with my relationships with my family that I know of. It was mostly very disruptive and addictive family patterns. There's a lot of hurt, a lot of conflict. And there's pathologies, mental health crises within my own family system with my parents, my mom especially. So I found where I get peace. That's a simple answer. And to me, that's love. So nature provided that. Now, the story on why fear, basically, when I was in environmental studies and I was studying environmental education, I thought, okay, well, that would be good to teach and take that as a career out into the world. So I'm not even 30 yet, still in my 20s, and I'm having these big ideas. And then a professor said to me, really wise professor, we all love to meet them every once in a while. They guide us. They don't have to be professors, but some guide. And they said to me, it says, well, you're very talented. You're a very good researcher. You've got all your science down. You're very good at facts. But he says, the problem is values. And values are really hard to put into facts. And so you got a problem. Humans are value driven. They're not fact driven. Now, we're partially fact driven. In other words, motivation based on some facts and knowledge and experience. But primarily, he was arguing our motivational tendency and drivers often are emotional, feeling, and value-based, which are not necessarily factually recordable and understandable through rational, logical understanding. And so for a scientist type like me, that was like, what? We can't just put the knowledge together and then people would learn it and then they would change in a good way? Well, you can see ethics doesn't work that way. I mean, religions have tried this forever in the history of humanity. And it helps to have those ethical principles, right? Myths, guiding stories, connections to great spirits and guides. And I'm not saying it doesn't help, but I'm saying in the complex world that I live in the 20th and 21st century, I think it's a lot more complicated than just going back to a lot of those old traditional teachings. So that is saying something about myself. I like to integrate tradition, but I also say we have to transcend tradition. And that's just my view, and that's what I'll call an integral view, and we can talk about what integral philosophy it is if you want. But it was that deep understanding that I have to get into the feeling, the irrational, this domain of dream, of imagery, of imagination. And once you get into that, you're tapping in more to the unconscious part of humans and humanity and organizations and societies. And you have to learn to work with that. So liberation to me says work with the consciousness, but also work with the unconscious, right? And those combinations, that is the education of what I call liberation. Education has to look at those domains. So that's a start. How I got into the fear was a vision.
Yeah.
And that was a love-based spiritual vision.
I was about to get into that, to say, I saw in one of the articles you wrote in the 90s, you spoke about this visionary calling. And because your work felt like a calling, I think that is why you've had the commitment you have to doing it, right? And to staying on this journey. I mean, one of the things you say in your work is, I'm well prepared to not see the fruits of theology in my lifetime. I realized this all from the start, when in 1989, my visionary calling came to me and the study of the topic began systematically. Why is this work important for you? And I think maybe because I don't think the families we are born into are by chance. And I'm sure you feel the same way. Looking at the kind of family system you were born into, and maybe the time when you were a teenager becoming a young adult, I'm sure things were very different in North America or just society. What kept you going, and what was this calling about? What do you? I know it's about fear, but how did it affect your life? And you spoke about your relationship with nature because you understand that is who you are. But that was not the socialization you got necessarily within your family. I'm sure you were like very different to the rest of your family members, perhaps. So can you tell me a little bit about that visionary calling and how you stay to the course? In my own experience, I know how being different can also bring about hurt and isolation and all these things. So how was that like for you? And at what point did you get to understand your work as your calling and therefore purpose?
Well, there is a complicated understanding of why I would have got into the study of fear and fearlessness, and they go together. It wasn't one before the other. They were completely dialectical. They're moving off of each other. The understanding of the importance of fear led to the spirit of fearlessness arising, and that was the guiding light for where to take fear. So it's not one against the other. They're dialectical in movement toward. And yeah, maybe I am in search of love. Who isn't? And, but what happens very early in life is we realize is that what people call love and what they call for the better for you. In other words, do this because it's good for you. It's good for everybody if you do that. In other words, follow, conform, and be that member of that normal society or that normal family and what a normal daughter would do or son. Yep. So it's all this normalization through socialization. I was already resistant to that very early in life. And so what I'm saying is I was struggling for my dignity. And I just had a spirit inside me, and I think we all have it, humans generally, that says, I deserve respect and dignity, no matter what. And so just with that foundation and knowing, right, that's inside, I'm glad I had that, and a lot of people forget it and forget to remember that they have it. There's a lot of good reasons they forget. It's painful to remember when you're being treated in non-dignified ways. It's painful to remember that, oh no, I actually am dignified and worth. Some people get that, but not most people. It's a huge struggle to recover. So I got it because starting very early at 12, 13, 14 years old, I started playing in rock and roll bands, music, because the Beatles were coming on in the 1960s mid, and that's when I was coming into my youth. It was prepubescent into early teens. And I'm coming on and I start growing long hair like the Beatles in England. And I thought that was just so cool. There was a generation of revolt. There was a revolution of love that turned in North America and from Europe as well. That, wow, we can change the world back to peace and love. So it's called the hippie generation. It was called the love generation. And then some people called it the me generation. Is the worst downside of that movement. But it was a spiritual, cultural movement. I was born and raised at the right time to catch it, you see, as a teen looking for something different. I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to be like that generation that started and was engaged in World War II and World War I and their fear that they brought to the new generation. We didn't want that. We wanted love. And we didn't want that fear. So I intuitively was catching catching it in a net. And then when you grew long hair, doesn't matter what color of skin you had, if you had long hair. So now we're looking at sexism, very, very deep rooted, and classism. If you weren't clean cut, if you weren't dressed, with your hair above your collar, nice looking, normal, we got attacked systematically by our school principals, our teachers. When you go on the bus, you get looked at, you get remarks made at you, people spit at you, you're called a fag, you're called everything under the sun. And I'm not even being a homosexual. It's just, it reminded people, you must be a homosexual because you're looking more like a girl every day. My hair was not that long. It was barely over my collar. I got kicked out of school with my bandmates for 3 days. We were suspended for having long hair.
That's an interesting era to have lived in. But one of the things you spoke about earlier is the issue of dignity. You and I have a relationship. We speak, and a bit about my story. You also know that my mother passed away when I was 17 years old. One of the most important things my mom, I believe, taught me. My mom didn't have money, so I had no inheritance. But she taught me about dignity and self-respect, right? And what we call siriti in my language. And she always used to say, it doesn't matter how much you have, whether you are wearing clothes from a Chinese store or from wherever. Wash your clothes and be clean. And no one can tell you. So people cannot treat you however because of your economic situation. And it's one of the things I'm so grateful for, because that voice has almost helped me navigate my way through life and to recognize when I was not being treated in a dignified way, and to walk away from those situations, even when economically, it meant a disadvantage for me. But when people did not honor my personhood, when I could not be who I wanted to be or express myself in the ways I wanted to express myself, it didn't feel okay, right? It didn't feel okay for me. And therefore, I often lost people because I demanded to be treated with dignity. And I demanded, I still do, to maintain who I am, and for that to be okay. And so it's very interesting that you speak about you wanting your dignity, and having that sense of self-respect, you honoring that, and how that led you to where you are right now. So there's just something that resonated very deeply with me, because I think many people don't understand it. I mean, we see how society is framed. We see how a lot of the time even women treat themselves or allow themselves to be treated because of this lack of dignity, or wanting to have their dignity, I don't know, to be seen beyond their social status, right? So I would.
Let me comment on the path of liberation just in general, because what I was going to say earlier is this spirit of dignity I also got from my mother, by the way, who was also quite an oppressed. She was sexually assaulted as a young teen in her own country. She was an immigrant to Canada, coming from Belgium. So I'm a child of an immigrant, first generation. My father was second generation immigrant from Russia. But it's like I grew up as an immigrant family in a culture that, I had parents who could barely speak English. My mom, for example, could barely speak English. She's grade 8 education. We're in the poverty level, of subsistence workers, doing shift work and trying to make it all work. And I just watched what it did to my mom. She would come home saying they called me a DP at work, and she's crying. I'm like 3, 4, 5 years old, and I remember hearing it. A DP? What's a DP? Displaced person. Yeah. That's what we called them in North America, the immigrants. But we're all immigrants in North America, except the indigenous peoples who have lived on the land for hundreds of thousands of years here. It's like, oh yeah, but you're more displaced person than we are. In other words, we've been here longer. And so you get into all that kind of classism. Right. So now you can't get around sexism. There's racism. There's ethnocentrism, because my mom was Belgium, right? Not English speaking, etc. She had an accent and so on. So I'm watching growing up with all that, but my mom was the same. She said she always dressed nice no matter what she could. When she went out, she walked with pride, held her body up. But at the same time, this is what I learned, which you didn't speak so much about your mother, which may not be the same case, is I watched how terrified my mom was still. You can put on the dignity look. You can utilize that to survive, what I call clinging. You can cling to your dignity, which is very much different than blossoming with your dignity. And that's a difference that along the liberation path, the healing path, this path of fearlessness, that's where I see we have to go. That's where the movement is. And of course, I can't tell people what to do with their life, how they want to live it. I can only put the water in front of the horse that's thirsty and say, it is water here. And I will stand and remind you the water's there, even if you are not going to drink. And so that's just a little bit of my teaching education philosophy around dignity, and the fight for dignity can still be fear-based in a toxic, unhealthy way.
So what is fear?
Fear is very difficult to define, but it's obviously a defense intelligence factor. So it's part of a defense intelligence that all organisms have. It's instinctual. Therefore, it's not bad, fear. That's why I don't put fear as opposite of love. I put them in a dialectical relationship. Same with fearlessness. Yes, fear needs to be corrected. No organism. So I'm trying to get divine fear in a very practical way. No organism, in my understanding and research and study and thinking and intuition, no organism wants to be in a state of fear for very long. They may have to be in it in a short term because it excites the nervous system of the more primal responsive system to defend yourself. Fight, flight, freeze, whatever you need to do. And there's more of those fear responses that we could talk about. But those are sort of the basic ones. And so that's good. But if you stay in a state of fear, even after you've escaped the threat, then you still keep remembering and thinking you're still in threat, on and on and on and on and on and on. It never goes away. Then you're in chronic fear. And that's fear patterning. When I use fear patterning, that's what I'm referring to. Not referring to this natural alarm response that's very free and flexible and intelligent to respond to a dangerous environment or a possible dangerous environment. But the system has to come back down. It has to calm back down from that distress to a more homeostatic state. Otherwise, our cells and our chemical systems start to burn out because you're running too high in threat hormones, basically. That's the chemistry. And that will deteriorate your immune system. That will make your brain not be able to do its higher functioning of cognitive, rational decision-making, and you're going to be reactive down on the base of your brain, which we call reptilian brain, which is responsive to fear and alarm. Signals.
I want to write this down. Michael, when I think in one of very earlier on interactions, when you read my concept document around my PhD work, we spoke about trauma because there's this sense that trauma and fear are related. But I think how society understands trauma, and I had to go back after our conversation to reflect on how I think I understood trauma, like not how I should be understanding it. To say trauma it's a response, right? So it's a response to these fear patterns. So trauma in its own is not a thing, but the fear that is toxic, that has been prolonged, that has not been addressed, is what creates the trauma. Can you just take us into that?
Yeah, I'll put it in a little bit slightly different words, and we'll see if that'll be useful for viewers as well. So I make the distinction between having pain and an accident, which we might call hurt. I've been hurt. I've been pained. Something has happened to me. It could be accidental. It could be someone dominates you, hurts you. It could be a many things. So I look at that from an organism's point of view, and your first reaction, more or less, to that is when you've had that incident of painful, transgression to your dignity and your integrity as a being, because you are possibly threatened by that, right? Physically and or psychically. So the system will defend. It's got all the defensive mechanisms are there, and that's part of the fear intelligence, the defense intelligence to respond. So what we do when we are hurt like that, I'll just call it hurt, that's when we ask for attention. Even an organism that lives alone, when it stepped on a thorn on its paw, what does it do? It doesn't go walking around like nothing's happening. It stops and it looks at its paw and it tries to get it out. And then it licks it. And then it relaxes and needs to sleep after that because it's really upset the system. You have to recover from injury. Now, when does a trauma set in? When would this is what I and a few others have said, this is where trauma sets in, and that's what I call a real hurt, an unhealed, painful memory. And humans have a huge brain to store those memories. Way more than other organisms. Way more. So we're vulnerable to storing unhealed, painful memories. And so the problem is, we have the incident, we reach out for attention. So social species, we reach out to mom, dad, our troop, our group, our tribe. That's what we do. That's when before you're conditioned to not do that.
Yeah.
So we go, look at this. The children won't leave you alone. They're in your face. They're grabbing your apron. Well, good for them. That's natural. You want attention because that's how healing works. They will get the attention, let them cry, let them shake and tremble, let them go through that traumatic experiencing, and then they won't have a trauma. They'll recover and be ready to move on and go play again. They'll be flexible. Their intelligence will be back. They won't be whining because it's over. They'll remember it. Oh, boy, step on that hurts. But they'll remember it without constantly fearing that they're going to get hurt again. There's a difference. You can remember not to go walking where there might be nails sticking up. But the worst side is when you become phobic and you don't want to go outside of nice, soft grass and everything nice and clean and stay in your home eventually, which is agoraphobia. I do not want to go outside of my home because I can't trust what's out there that might hurt. It's the worst nightmare for a living organism to get to, but it's happening. It's real, and it's happening on small scale. We're avoiding, and that's the phobic reaction, right? You start avoiding environments before you even know what's in them. Because you're imagining from that unhealed, painful memory, it might happen again. I might get raped again. I might get this again. Now, that gets really complex when you're someone of a person of color, like a person of color walking in a world of white peoples, and they're a higher class than you are or whatever, right? You're a marginal group. So that's what I'm referring to. Mm-hmm. That gets really tricky because just walking in the neighborhood, you probably will get hurt again. So now that adds a dimension, and that's what I call the culture of fear phenomenon. And it's a culture of repetition and repetition of post-traumatic engagement. It does not let up, or only minimally lets up. But unless you stop walking out in the streets where you want to walk and go to the grocery store, you can see the incredible damage it can do to marginalized people who are very susceptible. But it's not just marginalized people who get hurt and traumatized. Mm-hmm. And the argument would be, if there's other people traumatizing you in the marginal group, they are traumatized people who have not healed their trauma. They are operating in a fear-based world that because you're so different, they can't trust you. So why aren't we building societies based on trust and cooperation? Well, there's reasons.
I want to bring in the family unit in this, because what's been playing in my head is this scenario of a buck, right? So out in nature, if a buck gets chased by a lion and it manages to run away, like you said, it will stop, but it will be trembling, right? So it will stop when it's safe, and it will be trembling, but it stops to address that until it's calm, and then it goes back, right? So in the instance of people and maybe communities, families, I think how trauma is then developed is people get hurt, and then there isn't a nurturing, there isn't the soothing, and therefore that hurt is not dissolved, right? People don't know that it will be okay. And so the problem then does not become the lack of safety in society, but rather the lack of perhaps the community who understands that once a person has been hurt, they kind of need that rest, the nurturing, to be made to feel secure again. And it's what has happened, particularly with communities of people of color. What is your take on that? Just bringing it down to the family unit, to individuals, and how we see this fear and trauma pattern, and how it shows up in society, essentially.
Yeah. So I'm just going to speak to all cultures, but you're asking me particular.
No, and I mean, you can speak about all cultures.
I will, but I think it's also important to speak about the marginalized cultures and certainly peoples of colors in a lot of parts of the world. Not all. It is dangerous just living. It's dangerous being. And that's not the case for me. It's not dangerous me being to go walking out in my world here. It's just not. And so we have to pay attention to that. So here's the lesson for me, if there's a lesson worth at least thinking about for peoples in marginal, is that family unit or that social unit, again, whatever the size of it is, whatever it is, every child is going to need a lot of adults and or peers around them who are not just helping them feel secure. That would be a mistake. So that's my thesis. Mm-hmm. It would be a mistake and very incomplete, because making them feel safe is not a full understanding of healing and the healing process. Mm-hmm. It's like the Band-Aid. It's the first step, right? Get them to feel secure for a moment so they can start to calm down, and they will actually go more deeply into their healing process when they feel secure. If they go in there and there's a lot of chaos and they're trying to get attention to calm down, but other people are just, they're in a mess and they're panicking or over other things or fighting about the finances or, then they go in there and all they can see is it isn't safe. So it isn't safe for me when I was out there and I got hurt by this, and it's not safe in here to try and get attention on that hurt. Doubly wounded. Double wounding. Goes deeper, and if that's repeated without the healing process coming and being engaged, and there's learning. We have to learn, relearn how to heal. And we can talk about that really at a grassroots level. I'm not talking always professionals. Talking grassroots. And I can share a lot about, I've taught 40 years of how to do that, how to hurt, how to deal with our hurts and healing in really peer-based ways. But if the child comes, experiences that, and it doesn't even have to be a child, you could hear it could be anybody, comes back to their community, comes back to their tribe, comes back to their partner, and that partner is already in so much fear and chaos and anxiety and distress about other things as well. You're going to get like zero attention of any quality. And the other thing is they do not actually want to see you heal because they don't have the attention to heal themselves.
Right.
So they sure don't want you doing all that crying, all that shaking and trembling and sweating and yawning and if not screaming and trying to talk through it until you're finally okay. So if they can't do that, if they're not given the support as adults, as caregivers, they won't allow it. And so that's when you get the statements, it's not that bad, shut up or I'll give you something to cry about, etc. And that's pretty across a lot of cultures that's been learned. That's coping behavior. That's not healing. It's not trauma-informed. It's coping. And a lot of it is just, that's the way it was done with me. That's how I was raised. That's how you're going to be raised.
That sounds very familiar. I've heard it so many times to say that is how we were raised. We were beaten up. Look at, we turned out okay. You know? It's like, and I mean, this is so clear how fear and trauma operate. It's very interesting to me that psychology and that kind of space, they have not put enough effort in understanding fear in this way and trauma in this way so that people can become more aware of what it is that they fear, which can often prevent them from living fuller lives, right? Which gets me to then, like, want to ask you, how do you think fear manifests in people's everyday lives? And I mean in the practical sense. I've seen it. I was speaking to somebody about it the other day, how a lot of the time people don't think they're capable of doing certain things for themselves because they're scared that they will not succeed, or people just don't do things because they're scared of the outcome or not knowing. How do you think fear operates in, let me say, toxic fear, because there's a healthy level of fear, right?
If I like the idea. One educator said to me, it's actually Jillian, the book I just had written and published on. He says, we have to admit there's a way more fear and terror in just existing. And it's when we deny that, how vulnerable we are, just as organic beings living in this cosmos of, one little speck of life that we know of in a universe. And what happens if the sun goes out or changes or a satellite hits? We are and species go extinct. It's like we have history of extinction. So we're so terrified at some deep existential ontological level. And he says we tend to be taught in our societies to ignore that. And then we're going to be brave and we're going to be courageous and we're not paying attention to the amount of fear and terror that's sitting underneath. And he says that's not good because that's when you make big mistakes. You're actually not in touch with reality. You're doing a lot of bravery and courage. You're flying to the moon or whatever, right? Creating missiles that can blow up another nation. Looks like we're really brave. So you can just hear it's fear-based. And that's why those weapons are so damaging. That fear, toxic fear, damages. It damages tissue. It damages social tissue, spiritual tissue. It rips, it damages, it toxifies. So I think what you're asking on a day-to-day basis, what obviously fear of failure and rejection. You can just go failure/rejection. So I often say to people, if you're going to decide at least, okay, yeah, maybe I've got more fear than I want to live with. If you can just even come to that, maybe I have a little bit too much fear I want to live with. And a lot of people say, well, I could learn meditation techniques. I could go to yoga. I could go jog more. I can do things to kind of burn off the distress, right? And there is a certain calming effect that comes from those. We know that. So people feel a little better. That doesn't mean that you change the fear patterning that is deep in that woundedness, in the trauma, and in the things that you're watching and hearing about in the world that are terrifying. Climate change is just one. You cannot not take that information in and be affected. And very deeply terrified. So that's very different than saying, how do I calm my fears? That's what I'd call just a very basic management. That's fine. But that's not a good education in fear. That's why I teach fear education, like sex education. We better understand it better than what we've been taught. So you can just see that applying to sex education, right? And the phobic reaction, the fear of teaching children about sex. It's the same if we try and do it with fear education. It's the same. Teach them about fear. Wow, that's so negative. That's so, we don't want to scare them. But I see that all as just like, it's very irrational. It's not, you don't want to know. You don't want to know what the truth is. Okay, we have to decide what's appropriate education for what ages. I'm an educator. I know all that. I'm a curriculum designer. But I just find we don't want to have the conversation like you and I. You try and get a teacher from the school system to have a conversation about fear that goes beyond the most basic, or about sex. It's like, they just like have a wall up there. Oh, we don't talk about that. And our parents don't want us to either. And the state doesn't want us either. And then you add certain religious belief systems on top of that and conservative views that might go with those. And now you've got a society that is quite ignorant.
So I see fear as one of those things that, and I think this is how we have discussed it, that limits a people's potential, right? Potential for freedom, a potential for just fully being themselves. What do you think are the patterns we can recognize around fear? And not high level, but everyday people in society. What are the patterns? So if one had to do a self-analysis of where they're sitting in terms of their relationship with fear, what are the key things you would say one can look at?
Well, I think you can look at, this is where I'm not going to be very satisfying for a lot of people. Is what you can look at is the difference between fears and fear itself. Because I actually don't study fears. I gave that up 30 years ago and said, I'm not going to focus on that. So many other people are doing it. That's what they focus on. There is so much literature, books, videos, talk shows. And they're talking about fears, recognizing fears. You look up in an encyclopedia of clinical psychology, and there's 300 or 600 phobias. That's because it's all about fears. Fear of X, fear of Y, fear of Z. You see, that to me is a distraction at some level. It's fine to a point. And then it's a distraction. It's a distraction because you don't want to actually look at what is the fear patterning, the fear conditioning of your society and culture and your family systems, your traditions, and how it's taught you about fear. You don't examine, you'll never examine that as long as you're just managing fears. You won't go there. You don't analyze that, generally. Okay. Although you might say, well, I got a lot of fear from my mom. You might say that. Or I got a lot from my dad. Yeah, you might get there. But that's not actually helping you understand the deep kind of education and conditioning you got. And what the conditioning that counts is what we talked about earlier. It's the fear conditioning that told us not to heal our wounds. More or less. That damage is unbelievable compared to fears. Fears is on the surface. It's this deep wounding that we were afraid to heal. Our societies have become afraid to heal, and coping is the new pill. Entertainment, addiction substances, sex relationship, we're addicted to all the things that are substitutes that keep us distracted from going deep into the analysis of the nature of our culture, society, our histories. It's not all bad down there, but there's a lot. There's a lot that ain't good.
I mean, we were on bias course together, and one of the things he and Aaron Manning speak about is how psychologists are basically, how do they frame it? Psychology polices capitalism, basically, and all these structures and whiteness and so on, right? Could it be related? So the reason why we are not getting into a deeper conversation about fear, could it be because of how things like psychology have been framed to almost pacify or just cover up the wound so that we carry on doing what we need to do, and they come up with more pills and coping mechanisms, more things to buy that make us look good, but at a deeper level, we're not?
And that's the danger about Kamalafi and the people in the course. They talked about the wellness industry itself becoming enmeshed in that kind of transferring, taking people up to feeling better without doing the deep critical analysis of the structures of a fear-based culture, a fear-based society. That's why I use that language. So you can see, again, that's exactly what I'm doing. And that is, where is racism? Where is, classism, sexism, ageism, adultism? All those isms of oppression. You have to study those. You have to understand something about those, how they're related to fear-based conditioning. And then I come up with a concept, as some others, of fearism. Fearism, to me, is the core of all other oppressions in its toxic side. Well, terrorism, we can understand that. There's all kinds of people studying terrorism. There's actually departments of terrorist studies and strategic development. You can get degrees and PhDs in terrorism studies. You cannot get a degree in fearism studies. Nobody even has heard of it in the academy, and they're not interested in it. I've tried to introduce them, and there's a little bit sneaking in the last few decades. Very minor, because they're more interested in terrorism. And I'm saying terrorism is just like the symptom of fearism that's been around way too long, and then it blows up. Some very dramatic event, and then we go, terrorism is going. Yeah, well, you didn't pay attention to 90% of the fearism that built up to that extreme drama.
So again, focusing on the symptom and not the actual problem.
Yeah. So that's how I would recommend people on an everyday basis. Understand how you think fear is operating, right? Recognize it. Realizes that it probably does limit you in a lot of things. But I can guarantee a lot of people justify fear and having fear in their life because they find it motivates them. There are CEOs who publicly put in their documents or on their YouTubes or their TED Talks, fear motivated me to be the great millionaire I am today.
Sure.
I do not. It's out there. It's been around for decades. So there's a very different teaching. You see what I'm saying? There's a very different teaching about fear. And then there's another teaching. These teachings on fear are quite contradictory. They're a mess. And humans somehow are trying to figure out which way is who's right, which way do I go? So that's where the fearologist comes in. The fearologist says, well, let's look at them all. Let's kind of put them together and let's do a critical comparative analysis. And then you, as a learner, getting that information from a fearologist or even becoming a bit of a fearologist, amateur fearologist yourself, you will make more critically individual, unique decisions rather than just listening to what everybody's saying about how to manage fear. That's the danger. And then sometimes we're listening to our father's voice or our mother's voice or our grandmother's voice or somebody teacher, and they were the ones that told you, don't be afraid. That's being a sissy. Those are powerful messages from our past. And it's not, to me, they're very inaccurate. They are not going to get to the truth about you as a human being. You have a right to feel fear. I even use the concept, so this one to throw out to you, I don't think you've maybe come across it, is as much as sexuality is a term that's been used to try to understand sex in a much broader developmental, historical understanding, sexuality studies, why don't we have fearuality studies? Why do I not say I have a fearuality just like I have a sexuality? See, I'm saying they are at least analogously equivalent of the importance to well-being, human potential.
Does feeling fear help us cultivate fearlessness? And what is fearlessness? And how does it look like?
It's like education. How can you have healing without education? To me, it's impossible. Every counselor I know, they may take people through healing processes, but then you come back and you try to educate them and do reflective learning. And there's always education going on in the therapy room. Same with, I think, any good healer, any good shaman, any good practice of that kind of work. It's not just about, I'll do it to you and I'm not going to teach you anything. Just be stupid. Come back next time. No, there's education now is going on. Right? So self-awareness, education, etc., formal and informal. So that's what I basically say is, fearlessness will open. It will continually open, and that spirit will keep growing. The spirit of fearlessness, because it's natural. Once we better educate ourselves on fear. And what I basically say is what happens is we've been taught to pay attention to fear symptoms. And we're not paying attention to fearlessness symptoms. Or sign. So, for example, pay attention to my rapidly beating heart.
Yeah.
I'm getting hot. I'm getting flushing. I'm afraid. I'm starting to, feel jittery. We're taught to listen to those symptoms really well. We will pay attention to them because your body's telling you to pay attention, right? Because it's doing things that aren't, quote, normal. That's good. But what happens is that's what everybody else pays attention to, too. Oh, wow, you're looking really scared. Your heart rate is da-da-da. And then we're going, yeah. And so everybody's caught in paying attention to the fear symptoms. And I go, who's paying attention to the spirit of fearlessness at the same time?
What does that spirit of fearlessness look like?
Does it look? It's just take it from the start. It's the spirit of reaction to, that spirit is in a reaction to the fear that's arising. Yes, it's true. Fear is arising. And so then, this is my principle, and so then does fearlessness also. You never have one without the other. This is a little bit by what hurt comes to you. Well, guess what's already arising? The moment you're injured, psychically or physically or any other way, what's immediately rising to a hurt? Healing. They go like that. You cut your finger. What immediately starts to do? White blood cells, defense system, already going to heal, to clean out the dirt so you don't get infection. New cells are starting to be produced, new chemical. The whole thing is like an emergency room. I'm saying that in every time you experience fear and are in a way transgressed, or it's a fear you even remember, right? That's coming back to you, haunting you, maybe a ghost. At the same time, your spirit of fearlessness is coming up saying, now you can heal this. That's fearlessness leading already, because no organism wants to live in chronic fear for very long.
But I mean, we see how our society has been conditioned, right? The dominant culture, we see the things that are happening in our society. So clearly people are not choosing fearlessness.
No. So one of the things I'm saying is we have to educate people how to recognize the spirit of fearlessness, how to recognize fearlessness, right? Is there. So it's recognizing your healing is like the simplest. Recognize a healing response. So shaking and trembling, you just got afraid, right? You saw a ghost or, somebody scared you, shouted at you, and you now got to go through all that physiology of being scared or like the lion chasing the buck.
Mm.
And then what you do is you allow the trembling and shaking to happen. Nobody's trying to hold you and stop you. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. You don't need, you're safe now. You're actually, sometimes we're squeezing them so hard, we actually stop them from allowing them to just go and tremble and be out of control for a while. They're like, nature is like that. Nature doesn't fit the nice categories of get it together because we're in the shopping lineup and I got to pay and get to, and I've got a meeting. See, that's not a healing society. And so you want to have 3 or 4 adults when you go shopping. So when the child gets injured or frustrated or he needs to do some healing work.
But Michael, in the reality of our time, where people barely have time to rest, how do we grapple with these things? People are like constantly just on survival mode. And I see it from this, side of the world. I look at ordinary South Africans, and I don't like using class to refer to people, right? But people don't have rest. I look at our transport system. For someone to get to work, an average person who uses public transport here in South Africa, it can take them on average 2 hours. Yeah. So it would mean they need to at least leave home at 6 to be at work at 8. Yeah. And when they get home, it's another 2 hours of being in transit. They are probably a single mother or whatever the case is. They need to cook, and whatever they're earning is not enough. So people don't even have the time to even deal with their hurt. People don't have time to allow themselves to do that. They don't have time to recover. So how do we think about these things in the context of the society we live in right now?
Well, we think about it as a great tragedy first. Yeah, I'm not interested in fixing it first. I'm not jumping on what the fix is. You can just hear me, because that a healing perspective says, I got to be with the tragedy. And what does that mean? What means you got to grieve? Tragedy means you got to grieve. This is wisdom from ancient cultures. This is not some new age psychological idea. Every society has to engage in its tragedy, that the world is not perfect, that the world is unfair, that the world is oppressive. And if you say to me, we have no time to grieve, I would say that's even a greater tragedy. The tragedy is you have to go on the bus for 2 days, hours every day or more. That's a tragedy. And the more tragedy is that you'll sacrifice during grieving because you don't have to. That's a greater tragedy. So I'm going to sit in that worst tragedy. That's a double tragedy. Why? Because it's not your fault, but you are hurting yourself twice by not grieving. Because you're not doing healing. It's against your nature not to heal. That is against you. And that's the way the capitalist system is designed. It is against you. That's a tragedy. So then we come to the question, how do we redo the capitalist world?
It's another conversation on its own. In preparing for this and for my own work, I came across one of your articles around the God of fear and the God of love. And for me, it made me think about how just generally, I think through the church, how people speak about God, to say God is love, and the fact that we cannot serve two masters. So we cannot serve love and fear, right? If indeed love and fear are gods. So can you take us through that understanding of how, is it Phobos? Yeah?
Phobos and Thanatos.
Mm-hmm.
So Phobos and Thanatos, let's back up. So this is like a cosmology. I was analyzing a cosmology for what would be a cosmology for a healthy, integral society, culture. That's why I'm investigating, trying to get away from this coping, fear-based cosmology. And there's other people who have been working. But in Western terms, in Greek philosophy, Plotinus was one of the main people talking about this thousands of years ago, and he said there's the great force of eros and the great force of agape. Notice my movement. Eros, agape. So he starts the cosmology on love. This is two forms of love, the arising form that moves sunward into the sun unity and then returns back to the communal earth. And that force of motivation, we're talking about forces of motivation. Eros, agape, two kinds of love. And then he says, but that doesn't seem to be the way the world is. The world has fear as well. It has things that move against love, or at least that's what it looks like. And this is the idea of we rebel against God. We rebel against the God of love. Again, whatever cosmologies you're dealing with or languages might be different, I think the basic theory can apply as an interesting analysis. So then what he says is when Eros arises and agape is about to, keep coming down, but we as a human or a society or group, we can choose to not come back down. And we went, oh no, I don't want to go back down to earth, communal, messiness, relationship. I love this striving up to the unity and this great transcendence. And so then we get up there and we spin, because you can't keep going up without coming down if you live planet Earth in a body. It don't work unless you're in a spaceship with a whole lot of fuel behind you, pushing you. That's the mess we're in. We don't want to come down. We don't want to return in the love of agape, which is this gift of the unity that then goes back to the many. Many then strive for the unity back to the many. So it's again a cosmology that's very harmonious and very beautiful. And then he says, so if we stop the cycle or break it up, then Phobos comes in and takes over Eros. And if we want to go down and we don't want to go up anymore, we just want to stay down low in the communal, on the ground, and the many, and we stop the striving for this different, unique. We stop that, then Thanatos takes over. So Phobos and Thanatos are just like, it'll come in if love is not working. In other words, if we don't have a loving community that builds a nest for our children to develop, and by nest, I mean from the physical to the emotional, the mental to the spiritual. If we do not have a nested complex of love, right, that would be like Eros and agape working nicely. We want the individual to grow and develop, but we also want them to return. And yeah, you got to be communal responsible too. Not just all about you. But yeah, we want you to be. So that's, again, you're balancing. And that's so when that nest, that beautiful movement of that cosmology of love breaks down, Phobos and Thanatos will come up. And those are the forces. Basically, Phobos is the force that does not want to return and wants to just stay up high. And that's the inflated ego, the heroic, the myth of the male forever can do it. I'll go to the moon if I want because I got the money to do it. That's Phobos just to the T. Thanatos basically is, no, I'll come back down and I'll bring a lot of death forces with me. Because if I can't grow and I can't get rich, I'm going to fuck up other people so they can't either. If I can't win the war against them, then I'll blow up the whole world because I don't want to lose. They're going to lose with me. That's Thanatos, the death drive in its worst pathologies.
I really enjoyed how you explained this cyclical sort of like movement, this harmonic relationship, and it made me think about something I spoke to another person I was interviewing or having a conversation with, and we spoke about the Hermetic principles, right? And it's very interesting that these things are there. And one of the principles is the principle of rhythm, which speaks to this up and down, right? And it almost seems like human beings are very much intent on working against nature. Even though we have all these principles, even though we know that we cannot aim to have the individual benefiting at the expense of the community, right? And the community extends into a relationship with nature. But we still have people wanting to relate in this way. And that's why we see the separation, isn't it?
I'm thinking of the author, M. Richards, or, Annie. Is there also her last name? They seems to have two last names. African-American philosopher, and wrote a book, which I can't remember the exact title now, but it was basically a deconstruction of the Western dominant worldview and its comparison with the Yoruba cosmology. And a friend, an African-American friend of mine, a colleague, lent me this book at one point, and I went, whoa, when I watched the Yoruba cosmology, how it was laid out, I said, it's love-based. It doesn't have the lack. It doesn't have a minus. It doesn't have a subtraction. It's got this eros agape, just like totally, and that's nothing to do with Greek society. That came out of Africa. That is original understanding of this beautiful cosmos of how it's also arranged. But then basically this argument from Richards was the problem with the West, the dominant, particularly out of the Abrahamic traditions of the Middle East, unfortunately, those religions and philosophies, they started in this notion, more or less, of original sin. That is a lack. In other words, you come into creation with lack. Yeah. And she argued, that does not happen in African Yoruba cosmology. There is no start in lack. It starts in abundance. The gift. So just a really, again, contrasting why today, certainly I speak as someone who I do give a lot of attention to, as much as I can, into the indigenous perspectives. And certainly African perspectives have been important, and I've had several African and African-American colleagues that I do connect with here and there. And I am attempting to help them, and they're attempting to help me try to rethink about fear and these fear-based knowledges and understanding. And so far, I can report after many years of connecting with these people, all good people, it's very hard for us to get very far.
Why do you think
there's places we just can't seem to align? A couple of hypotheses. Thank you. And you can probably help, or your viewers can comment on. One is that the Africans that I tend to meet are from Nigeria mostly, and they seem to be very commerce Western driven. even though they will integrate and try to keep, I can see them working on keeping traditions, and they will bring those in, but they're making a mix of East and West, or their view, African and let's just say American or European. And I am sort of struggling to decolonize the West out, and they're attempting to bring the West in to Nigeria because they see Nigeria has to grow. They have a view that Africa has to grow. It has to keep up with the West. But we'll keep it also in control, and we'll keep our views. And so I just see their struggle.
But I mean, if the fundamental principles of the ways in which we exist are not based on the right things, so for example, like love or abundance, and these ways of being in community and with each other in regenerative ways, then I don't see why people are so obsessed with Western thought and development, as it were. I mean, we see what development has done.
So I named one. I named economics as one hypothesis of why I think there's the troubling of attempting to not be a third world, attempting to not be, right, and to keep up. So that's one. And they want to advance technology and science, and I understand all that. I'm not saying it's not good, but it's what gets sacrificed in that. And so the other one hypothesis is a lot of Christian thought still pretty heavy in the people I've met. Even though they say, oh, it's not that important, and they're philosopher types, and they, oh, it's not important, and I'm reading it, and I'm going, come on, you guys, it's there. I see it. I see the Christian theology. I see it in there. And I'm a critic of that, and they're not so critical of that. So that's another reason we just don't jive. No, interesting with you, that has not been an issue. Even though our relationship is early, I find your thinking around both the economics and religion is much more fluid, porous, and guess what? All the ones that I'm trying to connect with are all males.
Well, there you go. There you have your answer. The dominant culture. The control. And all these things that we've come to value as what success is, right? Forgetting precisely what we are giving up when we choose to look at life in those ways. And I think what we often give up is far more valuable than any tech economy or whatever can give us, So it's a very interesting thought to hear from you. And I actually wrote about it in my master's, because my master's was based on women's social entrepreneurship as a bridge to social development and economic growth. And what I saw from my personal experience, a lot of the work I do is based on my experiences, is that the women bosses I've had, they have gone beyond what their job description required them to do. And that often meant caring for what time I get to work, caring for other things that were beyond my job description or pay grade. They would often give me opportunities because they got the sense that I was curious, that I wanted to grow. And it's not something that is prevalent in male leaders. However, many feminists sort of like view this feminine energy or as something that is a sign of weakness, and they call it stereotypical, and the fact that women should not sort of lean into that feminine part of who they are in order to lead, right? They see it as a weakness. But I look at the time we find ourselves in now, where we have seen what male dominance has done or patriarchy has done, and I feel like it's time for a healed feminine energy to rise and to show its leadership and to get involved, and for the matriarch to also come, because our sense of leadership is very, very different. What we deem as important and valuable is very, very different. And we need to lean into that, right?
Yeah. So path of fearlessness, just to continue as a response to liberation by invoking a curriculum of the path of liberation and fearlessness, for example, there is no doubt in my mind you have to do decolonizing work. You have to do re-feminizing work and rethink all of those relationships to the feminine, and a re-childing work. That the children are the foundation of what we as adults need to relearn that we forgot. Why am I a teacher? Why do I volunteer at a daycare center, once a week myself for the last 3 years? Because I know that children will help recenter us as well in their value, not so that they're just something that we serve off, shove off, and collect them at the end of the day and try to build lives. I know there's huge problems for the whole daycare industry, but it's also a capitalization where the parents are having to work way too much. So it feeds, everything is being fed. And then we have an industry of, we'll look after your children.
Going back to fearlessness, and maybe just having a very basic understanding of fearlessness. For me, I've sort of seen how I've had certain fears, but I've been able to still do things, and I think, it's a bias. I think there is some fearlessness in that, but the fearlessness has been connected to a faith to say, I have this dream, and surely God planted this dream inside my heart because I'm capable of achieving it. So even though sometimes I would have moved at a very slow pace and maybe attending to those wounds, but I've required faith in something greater than me in order to be fearless in certain instances. Do you think there's a relationship between faith and fearlessness?
Sure. Yeah, I do. Yeah, for sure. I always like to say, faith still goes with reason still goes with faith. It's not one or the other, but faith is one factor or an important factor in making reasonable, good choices and living a life that is one of commitment. So faith is just a really complex because it involves issues of how we understand hope. How we work with hope is another part of the bag of tricks and skills and supports for ourselves. I can only say that it's such a huge conversation to go into what is fearlessness for me. I just been on this path too long. It's so complex. And so, I would just suggest that at least we think about fearlessness something like this, minimal. We are born, we come into the world, we have to face the world as this new babe into the new world. So we came from the mother's womb, generally a pretty darn good place to live for most of us. And I call that no fear. So that's the phase of no fear in our experience. We have that deep in us. We know there's a place to live that is no fear, more or less, right? But we come out, and then we're pulled out. The cord's cut. Got to survive in the world. All the things. Your parents are busy. They're not going to be there for you all the time. You get hurt. You get wounded. You're not healing all those hurts. But we still have that spirit of fearlessness. Went from different forms. No fear. The next one is bravery. In other words, bravery is you act when you have to. So this is like the mom who sees a car about to run over a child, and she'll step out in front of the car, save the child, or lift the car. You hear these stories, urban legends. That's bravery. You do what you have to do to survive or save a child, right? Save another's life. Bravery operates on that kind of really deep instinct of, what do you have to do now? Not a lot of thought. Courage is the next phase of the spirit of fearlessness. So I'm showing different manifestations, right? Different ways I think you can classify. And I do this in my book. called The World's Fearlessness Teachings. I lay this out very carefully, and the research and literature I'm supporting. So the next one, courageous, is where you're more thoughtful of being brave. It's not just brave reactive, it's thoughtful. And at some point you might go, yeah, I'm really going to go on that protest and I'm going to march down as women marching in the night, against fear. Well, that's courageous. That's not just brave. That's courageous because you've thought about it. It feels like it has an ethical component. It's reflective. You're assessing risks and so on. But courageousness then has to move to the next phase, and that's I call fearless, fear-less. And there's a whole kind of thinking I've seen in the societies as well that is around that. And what's different than that than courage is when you move to fear-less, you're starting to understand that fear is not just mine to overcome. It's the society's problem to overcome. My culture, my religion, my whatever, the nation. So you realize when you're acting, right, fear-less, you're acting toward a world that has less fear. So it's a little higher than just courageous, I'm going to go out and march or something. That they're a little bit connected, so it's this continuum. And then there's a big jump, and that's where true fearlessness exists on the other side. That's how I've theorized it. And then there's another stage beyond that, which I call fearless.
Yeah. Your book.
And so those would be complex, but I do have that in the book, The World's Fearlessness Teaching book. Yeah.
For sure. But you've recently published another book, right? If not 3. Oh, you write so much. Your commitment is incredible.
Yeah, but it's just the end of a trilogy of great educators, I call them, who have tackled the fear problem in their own ways. And this was an African-American educator, 30 years in New York and the Bronx, teaching inner city kiddie, mostly African-American students in the poor parts of the Bronx. And what he learned as an African-American thinker and really diverse thinker, he also had a spiritual perspective. He was Christian, but he went way beyond Christianity to non-dualism. He read Buddhism. He read the Bible. He knew the Bible inside and back. I did a study. This is the short. I did an autobiographic study, not autobiographic, but biographic and intellectual. How did he form his thoughts? Why did he, as an educator, come up with this theory about fear? And I'll just summarize it. His theory about fear is we're not fearful enough. I alluded to it earlier in our talk, that to be in touch with reality, you better first be in touch with how fearful reality is. And he, as a black man in America, a lot of smart about that. Like, that's not what necessarily a white guy is going to think about. You see what I'm saying? There is a cultural and there's an ancestral African sensibility and knowledge. This guy is still thinking in how do you decolonize slavery and how we've all grown up. And so the last thing he wants is a bunch of courageous and brave, mainly brave and bravado, black people going out thinking they're going to change the world. You know what? You're going to be slaughtered. Sorry. And if it isn't police shooting you, it'll be X, Y, Z, or other more subtle forms of undermining black culture in America. So I had to learn as a white guy, wow, his theories on fear were very different. We had some conversations over 10 months by emails because he wrote 2 books on fear. There is no other black person on the planet I know of who has written 2 books dedicated to fear. That's pretty cool. I was fortunate enough to meet that person in emails. I never got to meet him. He died in 2016 before I knew he was dying. But I got to converse with his wife. And we had great conversations. I interviewed his granddaughters and some of the nephews and nieces and so on. So I put this book together from all of those bits. So I just wanted to share a bit from that. And, if I had to read anything, let me just read his quote at the beginning. in my book on the preface. And this is Sam and Jillian saying, by getting involved in helping others, we reduce the negative fear that we feel and increase the positive fear that we all have a right to feel. Strength, courage, and wisdom require that we examine ourselves inside. For as the Greek philosopher Socrates reported to have said, quote, the unexamined life is not worth living, even if you don't have enough time. All too many of us have been too negatively terrified by life itself to begin bringing any of our deeply repressed fears to the open. So his whole education is, let's look at how terrifying life is, but do it in a positive way so that you actually enjoy it. That was his aim as an educator. That is an amazing direction. I have never seen anyone.
And that is what liberation is, right, Michael? That is what liberation is. I think we have a long way to go, just as society, to get to that a life without reflection is not worth living. I see so many people going through life with no or very little reflection. But I also understand the burden that comes with this deep reflection, because how one then gets to relate to the world can become like a very isolating, because from my own experience, you see things that people don't see, or that many people do not see. You feel many things that people don't allow themselves to feel because they choose to not reflect. And I think it is such a pity. It is such a pity. And I think it also, people do not really get to live their full potential because there isn't that reflection. There isn't that questioning. Why am I doing this? Why am I not doing that? Why am I accepting this as the norm?
Yeah, you gotta do that work in liberation work, and at the same time, 50% on the I. That's what you just articulated, the I. And 50% on the society and culture. Why does the society? Why is it that? So, I and the we. If you do not look at those structures at the same time, you're going to just be into a self-psychology of trying to fix yourself and make yourself feel better. Sorry, liberation work doesn't work that way. Maybe wellness does, and you can go and feel good. But liberation work is you have to also work compassionately on deconstructing, decolonizing, refeminizing, re-indigenizing, all these really hard, complex works. But if we do it together, there's so much joy in living authentically, this authentic that we can all live, more or less. And it's tragedy that we all don't have equal opportunity to do that. We have to fight for that. Yeah.
Anything you want to share with us before we end our conversation for this evening?
I will say maybe one thing is, I can speak because I have a PhD and I've had such privilege to do, 12 years of post-secondary education. Post-secondary, I can't believe I've gone to school for 24 years. I can't believe, I don't like school. I can't believe I did that. And then all of my freedom that I've chosen to live, and certainly there's been a price to just study, to think, to write, to be a contemplative. I'm not an ordinary person. I do not work an ordinary work life. I do not have financial givens that those people have who accumulated wealth. I have nothing. And that's where I have to walk the path. But I never have done it alone. And that's my message. You cannot do liberation work and be very successful. I've lived and worked in various conscious communities. So we're talking about a conscious conversation on your podcast. And I was thinking, yeah, it's conversations in conscious communities. I've been lucky enough since 1980 to find a conscious community that I could participate in and do this deep relearning about who I am, how I can be. Then I found another community, which is a therapeutic community to live and work in, which was for youth and families who were in destruction, addictions, and falling apart. I was able to be part of that therapeutic community for 10 years. Then I found my own community and founded it, called In Search of Fearlessness. And that community was the learning adult education, liberation work. That's where I discovered about the fear vaccines, the fearlessness path, and I had people practicing it with me. So all I'm saying today, and thank you for feeling so much for this, I'm curious what you're feeling, but I am not just an intellectual. I have lived so much of this learning path.
I mean, I sent you, is it yesterday when I sent you my message of gratitude? You speak about community and finding this conscious community and being able to do this work in community. For so long, I have struggled. As a 35-year-old in South Africa, with the socio-economic background I come from, and the burden of trauma I've had to, or I am processing and healing from, it just reminded me how I'm grateful for the community I am finding and for you being part of my community, right? Because it becomes very difficult to do this work alone. So I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, you're right. You're spot on when it comes to finding that community, because it's very painful to do it alone, to see the things that one sees, to be able to reflect on. Yeah, so thank you for being part of my community.
I'm just going to add, because community can be interpreted in so many different ways, right? And, I've been lucky, Barbara and I, 35 years together we've been, and we started. I said, I'm not getting married again unless it's a community. I said, it has to be about the path of fearlessness. And are you in or are you out? And she said, I'm in. Okay, here we go. And what I'm saying is we have come to use the word caring community or a caring field. That is community. And yes, it's caring, but it also has to be about liberation as far as I'm concerned. That's for me. I'm not interested in communities that are just about caring. Immediate caring and liberation. Thanks very much for today. Loved it.
Thank you very much, Michael.